Musk versus Zuckerberg. It all started with Elon Musk responding to a Twitter user, quote, I'm up for a cage match if he is LOL, unquote. You see, prior to that, the user had warned Musk to be mindful of what he says about the Meta boss because Mark Zuckerberg is a BJJ practitioner. Zuck, if you will, responded with, send me location. Habibesk, if you will. Musk fired back. Vegas Octagon. This thing started picking up. So of course, UFC President Dana White he stepped in, saying, "quote This would be the biggest fight ever in history of the world, bigger than anything that's ever been done. It would break all pay-per-view records. These guys would raise hundreds of millions for charity. You don't have to be a fight fan to be interested in this fight. Everyone would want to see it." What do you think of White's eagerness to put the UFC's name behind Musk versus Zuckerberg? Goes, we go to you for the first take.
What are we doing here? I get it. It's a huge payday. People will watch, but announce it properly. If you're going to announce a fight like that, have a bag of money in one hand and twirl your mustache in the other, because that's what you do. You're being the world's biggest supervillain at that point. This is not the place for it. This is the UFC. We're going on 30 years, guys. That's 30 years of Dana White and the Fertitas trying to build this sport up. People making all kinds of jokes, finally getting it on ESPN, on bigger platforms, on Fox, and then you're going to turn around and do something like this, fresh off of the heels of saying you don't do gimmick fights. Then you're going to try and convince us that this isn't a gimmick fight, which it totally is. What do you call it, a crossover fight? It's not a crossover fight, guys. The only thing we're crossing over into is Fantasyland. This fight will never, ever happen. If anything, UFC fighters going over to boxing, that is crossover. There is boxing encompassed in the training of mixed martial arts, and they're crossing over in boxing and they're testing themselves. That makes sense. I get that. But this fight here, guys, it's just going to throw away all the validity that we've tried to battle for years. Not just the Dana White and the Fertitas. Us, guys, we're at the forefront of this too. We're constantly getting berated by people. Your sports this, your sports that. How are we going to look them in the eye if we're putting on fights like this? It just doesn't really make sense to me. It's a glorified world star for billionaires. This is not the place for it. This is the UFC, high level, high caliber athletes, the best in the business. Keep that in something else. That's why you have slap fight. Make them slap each other. Do that, but keep them out of the UFC. I'm not saying I won't tune in. I'm a dork just like everybody else. I'd want to see it. It's not gonna be a good fight. I'll tell you that right now. It has no business being in the UFC.
Especially goes off the heels of Emmett versus Topuria, Barber versus Hibas. I mean, that's fighting. You know what I mean? And then to read this headline. All right, Fada, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get why Dana White would want to get behind this, especially that the word octagon was being used. And yes, of course, it'll be the most viewed pay-per-view fight, if we want to call it that, ever. So I get why Dana White would want to be a part of this. The only issue I have with it is him saying it's not a gimmick fight because, I mean, of course, it is a gimmick fight, if we could even call it that, because at the end of the day, I know Mark Zuckerberg does some jujitsu, but Elon Musk, I don't know. Dana said that Elon said he's had fights before. I mean, yeah, that's the thing for me. It's like the UFC taking part of it, fine, but it being an actual UFC event, it would just be weird. Like it's, I don't know. The fighters seem to be happy about it. I get it. We had Dominic Cruz, George St. Pierre offered to train these guys and whatnot. So I understand why the fighters would want to get behind it because they get exposure. And if you can throw a bunch of people, whoever is going to be a part of that card is going to get the most insane exposure ever. It's just weird for it to be in the octagon and weird for it to be dubbed as not a gimmick fight because it's absolutely that. I just don't know. It's weird, but I totally understand why Dana would want to be a part of something like that because obviously it would be absolutely massive.
Mm-hmm. All right. Nolan, how about you? What say you, my friend?
Well, I guess I'm sitting here twirling my mustache. I certainly get it. I mean, even if it's not your cup of tea, I think that combat sports in general has always been a bit of a circus, right? And so I kind of compare this somewhat to the boxing world recently with the influx of influencers, where there was a lot of people in the boxing community that were frustrated by this. They didn't like it. They didn't like the idea that there were two guys getting in there with gloves. But honestly, at that point in time, I was very okay with it. I thought it brought boxing some good exposure. We see what Jake Paul does, where there's undercard fighters that get all sorts of opportunities because of this, whether it's exposure or, getting paid. So for me, I mean, I kind of look at it like combat sports has always had kind of weird fights. I know the UFC in general is not known to do that. I think Dana White is totally, come on, man, like this is a gimmick fight. This is, if you were to like think of a gimmick fight, what an example would be, like a far-fetched example of a gimmick fight, it would be this, right? So I don't agree with him on that, but I certainly understand why he wants to get involved in something like this. I mean, this would probably be the highest grossing, most viewed, most talked about fist fight in the history of televised pay-per-view fist fights. So with all that, and if the money does go to charity, I mean, I think this is pretty harmless across the board. If this became the brand that the UFC is, they started inserting celebrity fights into the cards, I could see, I wouldn't love that as a consumer. But at the same time, I do think that this is just so mainstream that it's a bit of an anomaly when it comes to booking these sort of celebrity fights. If it never happened, would I personally care? No, it's not my sort of like thing that I'm sitting around at a bar talking to people about who's going to win this. It's certainly not, I'm not interested in that way, but I just think this extends so far beyond what our small combat sports community would be interested in. Like it's just such a mega, two of the most famous people in the world and in this generation of human beings. So I certainly understand why somebody would want to get involved, especially with the exposure that he could get his brand. Whether the money goes to charity or not, I'm sure would either A, make him look good, or B, would be good for the pockets. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll preface all this by saying, like, we don't know what the reality is for this fight either. Like, is this actually something that's going to happen? I mean, 99.9% of the time when we discuss things, or when things like this get brought up, I remember a couple of years ago, there was some brief moment where there was talk of Tom Cruise versus Justin Bieber, and I think Dana was asked about it, and then that was it. I mean, I don't think they were sitting down having contract negotiations about that fight. So is this a promotional thing? Is this something that could actually happen? Is this something that would happen under the UFC banner? I mean, Mark Zuckerberg attended a UFC event, and it seemed like they weren't even allowing, because he was there, they didn't allow anybody to be there. So would this be even something people would be able to go watch? Probably not. It would probably be only a pay-per-view thing. And so would that mean other fighters would be able to be there? Who knows? So there's a lot of questions. I almost feel kind of like this is silly to talk about at this point, because my brain instinct is like, whenever there's a fight promoter talking about something that involves people like this, I just think it's something that's never going to happen. But overall, in the scheme of combat sports things, I think that if this were to somehow materialize in the fantasy land, that I think it would be pretty harmless overall.
Okay, so let me meet you halfway, Nolan. I think I agree with you in that some of it is captivating and interesting. But come fight night, that fight's going to be awful. We all know it's going to be horrific. So does this make a mockery of the sport in a way?
I don't think it makes a mockery of the sport, because I think that they've always been doing stuff like this. I mean, we look at the earliest roots in Pride, and they loved having huge dudes go in there as sumo wrestlers and fight tiny dudes. I mean, we've seen this over time. When Jose Canseco jumped over, the UFC had CM Punk compete. Bellator's had Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie. I think it's kind of tough for me to not think that that there is an inherent, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but there is an inherent circus act that comes with the combat sports world. So I think that damage is largely already done. I mean, we see people hopping over, trying to do boxing matches all the time from every, corner of the universe at this point. So I think again, the UFC can't claim like they never do gimmick fights. This would be this would be the ultimate, well, you can't say you don't do that. So, I mean, in that regard, I guess for people that view the UFC in that sort of a light, that they don't do this sort of stuff, or that they're not interested in this sort of stuff, or that they're beyond this sort of stuff, then yeah, I think that in that regard, it will have that effect in terms of their public image.
But at the end of the day, those guys were like athletes, right? In Pride, like, yeah, some of them are wearing luchador masks and all that. I get that. But they were athletes. In this case, these are two guys that sit behind a keyboard, and I get it. Zuck trains. I don't know what the hell Elon Musk does, but it's not to any level of being in a cage, let alone the UFC. It's just like, if you're going to do crossover, man, do Francis Ngannou and John Jones. Like, you have the power to do that.
Yeah, cross them over.
Huh?
I was going to say cross Francis back over and let's focus the energy on that, I would say, than these other two guys.
It's going to be a lot of publicity, and I get that. But guys, I want you to picture something, right? We're all watching Sports Center at the end of that night. Anybody that's watching that, more than likely, aren't they going to be laughing more than anything?
100%. I mean, that's part of the fun. I mean, you look at the 90s, right? I believe ESPN ran a series that was celebrity boxing, and I think there were a lot of athletes on that, but I think there were a lot of people that weren't. By the way, look up Manute Bol versus William the Refrigerator Perry if you want to see something bizarre. But I almost think that this is like extends beyond that again. Like, I just think this is such an anomaly of a fight of a sparring session that it almost doesn't matter. Like, the question to begin this whole thing was Dana White's eagerness to get involved. I get it. This is going to make a lot of money for someone. Like, I think it overextends past the point that he would feel uncomfortable booking a fight like this. Again, am I going to be sitting around, with my buddies talking about this? Am I going to be really crushed if this doesn't happen? Is it even something I'm rooting for? No. But I just think overall, I view it in the span of the decisions the UFC has made, whether it's slap fight, whether it's fighter pay, whether it's all these other issues that we talk about. I don't necessarily see this as a actually harmful sort of activity.
If you have a blue check mark tomorrow, I'm going to be really mad at you.
Busted. I had one, but he took it away.
Fada, what do you think this does for the exposure of MMA? You think this helps, or? Oh, are we losing connection with Fada? Okay, Goes, let me ask you that question. For example, the other day we had
to suppress their excitement,
John Gotti III versus Floyd Mayweather in boxing. They went out there, they barely boxed. They were holding, then a big melee broke out, and then what did a lot of people say? This wasn't good for boxing. That's what I'm saying. Not that these two are going to cause all that, but in a way, their awful performance, is that just going to be not a setback? Because the sport's successful. MMA's legit. I'm not saying that, but just in terms of like, do we really, really need this? I mean, both men are so rich. If they want to give some to charity, give it already. You have more than what you could make on that particular night. So like what Nolan was saying, someone's going to make a lot of money. Yeah, the UFC. So can we blame Dana? No, because he's a promoter. But at the same time, it does contradict what Dana does try and say at times where he's trying to be so serious. He'll check a reporter, lash out a fan, cut a fighter, because this is the brand he's trying to protect. This is the sport that he built. And then, the next day he wakes up and says, let's get some pillow fights going or a slap league going. Like, I don't know. It's so bizarre to me.
Well, I think that's the thing, right? Is if he had that stance from day one that, hey, we're just the UFC, we kind of do silly things from time to time, I don't think that many people really have a problem with it. But it's when he's up there and he's trying to say this sport's going to be bigger than soccer and he's comparing it to all the other sports, that's when people have a problem, because we don't see this, right? We don't see the fastest wide receiver in the NFL go, I should race Usain Bolt. Like, that just doesn't happen. Somebody checks him right away, right? So you can't play both sides. And I think that's where people have the most problem with some of these situations with Dana White, is sometimes he plays both sides. And I don't know if he does it because he thinks we're all dumb enough that we're just going to eat it all up. I guess some of us do, right? But I just think every once in a while you have to kind of bring this guy back down to reality. And reality is, at the end of the day, man, you can do something like this, but you cannot compare your league to all the other leagues if you're going to be doing stuff like this.
He does it on the heels of losing Ngannou and Jones. That's kind of what makes me the most mad.
But then he turns around and he wants to book John versus Fury. So again, I mean, I wish because he said this a number of different times, right? Where he said we don't do gimmick fights, or we don't, we're interested about putting the best athletes, the best fights together in the world, blah blah blah. I don't know why like CM Punk never gets brought up in that conversation. You know what I mean? Like that's something to me that was like, well, you did that. And I would be interested to hear what his answer was. But I mean, let's face it. I mean, at the end of the day, he's a promoter and he's Dana White and says this sort of stuff. I mean, it shouldn't come as a shock to us that he would contradict himself even in the same press conference. I mean, I think the time that he went off about the gimmick fight about Francis and Fury, like 10 minutes later, he was talking about the BMF title, and it's like, it's a bit of a token. I think that's a harm to me. The BMF title, I see some people don't like it. To me, that's a harmless thing. You know what I mean? It's like a side show, sports to be fun, whatever. So I don't mean to like dump on it, but at the same time, you can't say it's not a gimmick. I think gimmick's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just you can't say that that's not a gimmick. You can't say Musk versus Zuckerberg's not a gimmick. I think they're way more gimmicky than Fury versus Jones or Fury versus Ngannou. That's more of an actual, maybe it's a half gimmick. Maybe there's a bit of a gimmick in there that it's boxing versus MMA, but it's still a fight. It's not a gimmick fight. It's a gimmick to sell a fight. So yeah, I definitely think he loses all credibility when it comes to that. But who knows? Again, I mean, do we actually think this thing's going to happen? I would say probably not.
Father, let's go to you for the last word on this topic. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I apologize for that connection issue. Yeah, I mean it's what Nolan said, because we've seen, like, when discussing things like Ngannou and Fury or whatever, we're saying like, Fury comes into the octagon, he'd get absolutely destroyed, and they should come to boxing and whatnot. So when we're saying things like that, and then we're talking about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk obviously has zero experience in any form of combat. It's just what it's pretty crazy to think what could come out of it. But again, like I said, I understand why Dana and the fighters would be excited about something like that, but it definitely is a gimmick fight.
Before we turn the page there, I do want to encourage the chat to participate. You can ask a question or leave a comment. We'll take the best ones and incorporate it into the show. Nolan, this is for you from Me Diamond 44. How can Nolan say it's an anomaly and then acknowledge that it's become a regular thing in boxing?
No. I'm saying it's an anomaly of two of the most famous people in the world fighting. I'm not saying it's an anomaly in terms of like two guys that don't have boxing experience selling a fight based on their fame or an MMA fight. I'm saying I think this, having two of the most famous people on earth fight, I think even though Dana has over time said that he doesn't do this sort of thing, I wonder which promoter would turn down the opportunity to book Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, to book, I don't know who else you could put on these level of international fame. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I was saying. Like the anomaly is how big these two people are that are seemingly want to get into a fist fight, allegedly.
Got it. All right.